This horror story happened to a friend of mine. It took place in late 2020 in the months of the COVID lockdown in the UK, in the town of Ayr, Scotland. On this cold, frosty evening, my friend Neelam, who was a 30-year-old woman, was getting ready to go to work at a hospital for the evening shift. During this time, road closures meant the hospital could only be accessed from her house via a quieter back road. She didn't really know anything about the neighbor, however, recently, for the last week or so, it seemed as though he had a house guest staying in his house. Neelam had noticed this house guest would stare at her in an inappropriate manner when she would be leaving or entering her house. He made her feel uneasy, and she always felt anxious when she knew he was outside. Then one day, while she exited her house, he was standing at the front of his house. For the first time, he actually spoke directly to her in a gruff accent, but what he said made her skin crawl. "Hey Neelam, my name is Alec. I just want to say you look amazing in those leather trousers you're wearing." Neelam wore these because she felt they kept her warm in the frosty weather. She is originally from the Isle of Lewis, so she knew how to combat cold weather. The fact he said this and the way he delivered this was inappropriate beyond words, and when she glanced at him, she told me he was looking her up and down like she was a piece of meat. She didn't respond, as she was in shock that this was the first time he had spoken to her. And this is what he said. "How the heck can this be the first thing you ever say to someone?" she thought. She jumped into her car, and Neelam almost dropped her glasses off her face as she was so shaken she felt as though she was going to throw up, as he was still glaring at her with a blank expression, and she said it was as though he was incapable of blinking. This felt as though it lasted forever, and it got even worse when she realized she had to defrost the car windscreen and windows. Her husband was also working, so she had nobody in her house she could turn to or make her feel safe. She then came to an even worse realization. She didn't have her phone. She sat in the car debating with herself whether to get it or leave it, as she would need it later in the night at the hospital. She decided she would quickly run in and get it. Neelam jumped quickly out of the car and ran inside, and she realized Alec was not standing there anymore. This filled her with relief, as it meant she wouldn't have to hear another inappropriate comment or see another inappropriate look from him. She unlocked the house and went inside. She was there for 30 seconds, picked up her phone and went to leave again until she heard a noise near the front door. The house was fairly dark, so this filled her with dread. It didn't seem as though anything was there, so she put this down to nerves after her incident with Alec. Neelam locked up the house and got back in her car. She then began her drive to the hospital. As mentioned, this was out in a quiet area due to road closures, so there were not many cars around and people weren't out as much due to the pandemic. After driving for about 2 minutes out of the residential area, she realized her car started struggling. She stopped the car, got out, and realized her back left tire was flat. But to her horror, it wasn't just flat, it had been slashed. She then took out her phone to make a call, when a car then seemingly from out of nowhere came up behind her with its lights on full beam. Neelam was practically blinded by this, and she had to turn away from the lights. After a few seconds, she heard the other car's door slam, and all of a sudden, a strong, gloved hand suddenly clamped tightly over her mouth. Neelam said tears began to fill her eyes behind her glasses. The panicked breath coming from her nose was visible in the evening frost. Her lips began to quiver behind the gloved hand, but she was too shocked to even attempt to scream or bite the hand. What happened next was the most terrifying moment of her life. She heard a familiar voice say, "All right, Neelam, hands behind your back." It was Alec. She was so confused, but in her state of shock and fear, Neelam put her hands behind her back, and the gloved hand was removed from her mouth, but it was replaced with some sort of rag. Neelam then heard the familiar sound of parcel tape being pulled, and her hands were taped up behind her back. Alex then turned Neelam around to face him and backed her up against the boot of her car. Her eyes were filled with tears as she was forced to look into his eyes. He took the rag out of her mouth and then put a long strip of parcel tape across Neelam's mouth. Neelam began mumbling and pleading against the tape that was gagging her. Alec then leant down and taped her feet together. As the brown parcel tape was covering Neelam's mouth, the breath from her nose looked like steam from a kettle on this now freezing night. Alec walked round to the front of her car and switched the engine off. While he walked to the car, Neelam noticed he hadn't taped her feet together as securely as her hands and mouth were, so she managed to kick her legs hard enough to break free. As Alec returned to the back of the car, not knowing Neelam had freed her legs, he was stunned when a swift kick from Neelam, as well as a loud mumbled grunt, connected with his groin area. He screamed and bent over, and then Neelam kicked him as hard as she could in his face, knocking him completely to the ground. Neelam was in shock over what had occurred in the past few minutes. The night was now quiet and still. With her hands bound behind her back, she walked around from the back of the car to the front. She caught a glimpse of herself in the side mirror. She then went back to the rear of the car. Neelam then rubbed the tape from her mouth against her shoulder until it peeled off. She then leaned against her car boot and managed to step backwards, so her taped hands now were in front of her, and she chewed at the parcel tape until they were free. Neelam took a few seconds now that her mouth was free from the tape to catch her breath back properly. She then grabbed her phone, which had fallen to the ground when Alec had grabbed her. She called the police and then her colleague at the hospital. The police arrived shortly afterwards, and Alec was arrested and taken away. He was charged and found guilty of attempted kidnapping and physical assault. Police then found out that Alec was staying in the neighbor's house without his knowledge. Neelam's neighbor had been staying with family because of the pandemic, so Alec had actually been illegally staying there. As you'd probably guess, Alec wasn't his real name. He knew Neelam's name because he'd been looking at her deliveries while they were sitting outside. Neelam began taking kickboxing lessons a few months before this incident, and she believes this may be what saved her. She has moved on from this traumatic experience with a lot of counseling and therapy. She and her husband have recovered from this ordeal, and they are grateful that Neelam is safe and well. We'd been driving for 2 days straight. It was me, my boyfriend Ryan, and my younger sister Leah. We were heading home to Maryland after spending a week visiting our grandmother. The plan was to make the drive in 3 days, taking turns at the wheel, sleeping in shifts, and surviving mostly on caffeine and gas station food. By the second night, we were somewhere in Oklahoma. Long, flat stretches of nothing. Ryan had been driving for hours and his eyelids were heavy. I told him to pull off the highway so I could take over. We spotted a rest stop sign, exit 212 facilities ahead, so we turned off. When we arrived, the lot was dimly lit, with just 2 flickering lamps and a single vending machine glowing like a beacon. Ryan walked around outside and stretched a little. Leah mentioned she wanted to use the restroom, so she hopped out and headed to the stalls. I stayed near the car, sipping lukewarm coffee, scrolling through directions. The map kept spinning as if we'd lost service. I remember thinking that's strange, but didn't dwell on it. Then Ryan crouched down by the front passenger tire. "Babe, this tire's looking low." I walked over and looked, and he was right. It wasn't flat, but definitely soft. "There's an air pump over there," he said, pointing to the far side of the lot near a small utility building. "We should fill it before we get back on the highway." I just nodded. We got back in, and I drove us over to the air pump, parking right beside it. Ryan got out and started hooking up the hose while I leaned against the car, scrolling through my phone trying to get a signal. My messages wouldn't send as the little wheel just kept spinning. A few moments later, headlights swept across the asphalt. A car then pulled up. The driver got out, a middle-aged man wearing a brown jacket stretching his arms. He glanced in our direction briefly, then walked toward the men's restroom without a word. I looked at Ryan, who was focused on the tire gauge. The hiss of the air pump filled the silence. I kept scrolling as the signal was still weak and the map wouldn't stop buffering. A few minutes later, the man came out of the restroom, walked back to his car, and drove off. His taillights disappeared down the highway before I even thought much of it. A few minutes later, Ryan was finished with the tire and wound up the air hose. All set. Should be good now. I checked my phone and noticed Leah had been in the bathroom for nearly 10 minutes. I then walked back around to the room stall and called out, "Leah?" No answer. Ryan walked over as well, calling her name. Still nothing. He went inside the women's restroom as I waited outside. Then there was bang, as if something slammed from inside. Ryan shouted something I couldn't make out, and I ran inside with my heart pounding so hard it hurt. When I reached the door, Ryan was standing frozen in the entryway with his face pale. Inside there were 2 stalls, and they were both empty. No sign of Leah. We searched everywhere, the restrooms, behind the building, the lot, even the tree line beyond the fence. Nothing. Her phone was in the car and her backpack was in the back seat. It was like she'd simply vanished. Ryan called 911 and the operator told us to stay put as officers were on their way. We stood under those flickering lamps with the weight of the silence pressing down on us. The police arrived 20 minutes later and 2 officers came out. They took our statements, searched the area again with flashlights, and ended up calling for backup. A few minutes later, more cars arrived. One of the officers stated that they'd checked the security cameras. Security cameras? I hadn't even noticed them. We waited outside, still in shock and disbelief, while officers moved in and out of the rest stop building. Finally, after what felt like hours, one of the officers approached us, but her expression was unreadable. "We found something on the cameras," she said quietly. "You're going to want to see this." They led us inside to a small office behind the vending machines. A grainy monitor showed 4 camera angles: the parking lot, the restroom entrances, the vending area, and the highway exit ramp. The officer rewound the footage and stated, "Watch here." On the screen, I saw our car pull into the lot. Ryan and I got out. Leah walked toward the restrooms. Then we moved the car to the air pump. The other vehicle then pulled into our old spot moments later. The man got out and went to the men's restroom. Then Leah emerged from the women's restroom. She looked around, saw the car in the spot where we'd originally parked, and then my stomach completely dropped. She walked straight up to the car, opened the back door, got in. "No, Leah," I whispered. The man came out of the restroom a few moments later, got into the car, and drove away. He never looked in the back seat. He never even noticed her. The officer paused the footage. "We've got his plate." Based on the timeline and the highway cameras, we tracked him eastbound for about 40 miles before the vehicle stopped on the shoulder. The officer said, "We found your sister there. She's safe." A trucker picked her up and called it in. "She's at a hospital in Tulsa, shaken up but unharmed." I sat there confused, trying to process what I just heard. She said the man realized she was in the car about 30 miles down the road as he heard her moving. He then pulled over, told her to get out, and drove off. He just left her on the side of the highway. A couple units are currently en route to pick him up. I felt everything at once. Relief, rage, horror. I couldn't speak. Ryan put his head in his hands. Leah had climbed into a stranger's car by mistake. He panicked and abandoned a teenage girl on a dark highway in the middle of nowhere. All because we'd moved our car to fill a tire. The officer put a hand on my shoulder. "We're taking you to her now." As we drove toward Tulsa, I stared out the window at the endless stretch of highway, the broken white lines flickering past. I kept replaying it in my mind. Leah stepping out of that restroom, seeing what she thought was our car in the same spot we'd parked, climbing in without hesitation. How close we'd come to never finding her, and how easily someone could just disappear. This story takes place in a remote area of the UK, but to protect the people involved, I won't say the exact location. My friend Zara is a British Pakistani influencer who had just recently had her second child, and her husband had gone away on a golf holiday, leaving her alone with the 2 children. She was used to being left alone, as her husband often worked away from home and would often go away on vacation with his friends, leaving her alone to take care of the children. It was a stormy October night and there was a lot of thunder, so it was noisy. She started to feel uncomfortable as it was getting dark early and her house is fairly isolated, so all the noise from outside was getting to her. At around 9 p.m., she had just finished a cup of coffee in the kitchen. The children were asleep and she made sure the house was locked up for the night. When she went back into the kitchen, she noticed that the back door was slightly open. She started to approach the door, but all of a sudden she felt very dizzy. She started to fumble and then she fainted. Zara slowly regained consciousness and noticed that she was now sitting in a chair in the kitchen. The first thing she was aware of was how heavily she was breathing through her nose. She felt something covering her mouth, and after twisting her lips, she realized it was sticky tape that was sealing her lips. Zara started to panic and tried to talk and shout, but the gag around her mouth was preventing this. She struggled to move and she could feel her hands were taped together behind the chair. When she looked down, She was duct taped to the chair and her feet were taped together. Her hard breathing popped the duct tape covering her mouth in and out. Then the lamp over her head switched on. Standing there before her was a medium-built man wearing a hoodie and a scarf covering his lower face. At this point, Zara was obviously petrified and was mainly concerned for her 2 children sleeping upstairs. The man then said, "I won't hurt you, but do you keep money in the house?" Zara mumbled, "No," against the tape. She also noticed that the man had a large bag which he had filled with items, including her jewelry from Dubai. The next thing he said sent a chill up Zara's back. "Don't worry, your kids are still asleep." He then walked away, heading for the back kitchen door, but before exiting, he turned and said, "I'm sorry for this." Then he left. Zara struggled with her bonds for a few minutes and then eventually freed her mouth from the tape by twisting her mouth and biting the tape. She immediately ran to check on her children, who had both slept through the entire ordeal. She called the police and the man was eventually apprehended later that week. As mentioned, Zara has an online presence, so the man was aware of this and was aware that she was often left alone. He admitted to gaining entry to the back door and drugged her coffee, which explains why she fainted. The burglar said he had lost his business and was in a desperate situation with the state of the economy, but he did not wish to harm anyone. Zara bears a resemblance to Kim Kardashian, and the fact she is a micro-influencer is likely what gave him this idea, as a similar situation happened with Kim Kardashian a few years earlier. Zara is a feisty young woman, so she did eventually learn to live with the situation. However, it's not something you can ever fully recover from. She couldn't help feeling sorry for the man who did this, but the feeling she had when she was in that position is something she'll never forget. I work late nights at a small grocery store in a quiet town outside Richmond, Virginia. It's not a bad job, it's just boring. I usually clock out around 1 a.m. and take the same 10-minute drive home through back roads lined with nothing but trees and the occasional mailbox. That night, the store was empty except for a few late customers, and I was looking forward to crashing on my couch. Around 12:45, I finished mopping the floors, then I clocked out around 1 a.m. and headed to my car. It was a 2012 Volkswagen Golf parked under one of the flickering streetlights behind the store. It was freezing out, so I unlocked the doors, tossed my bag in the passenger seat, and started the engine to let it warm up. My car doesn't have a remote start, so I had to sit inside for a bit. I scrolled through my phone for maybe 2 minutes, then realized I forgot to take the trash out. I sighed, left the keys in the ignition with the engine running, and ran back inside. I was gone for maybe 3 minutes tops. When I came back out, I stood there frozen. My car was gone. I just stood there, holding a trash bag, staring at the empty parking space. I thought maybe someone was messing with me, but there's no one else who closes that late. I fumbled for my phone, ready to call 911, when I realized something worse. My backpack was in the passenger seat. My purse, my phone charger, my house keys, everything. I sprinted back inside, locked the doors, and called the police. The only good thing is that I had my phone with me. They said they'd send a unit out and told me not to touch anything. I paced the aisles for 20 minutes until an officer showed up. He was a tired-looking guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He asked for the usual details, then said they'd check nearby cameras. I told him there's one that faces the back lot. We walked over together and we reviewed the footage. The video was grainy but clear enough. At around 1:02 a.m. I walked out, got in my car, and sat there scrolling. Then at 1:04 a.m. I got out and jogged back toward the store. At 1:07 a.m. a man appears from the tree line. He walks straight to my car, looks around once, then climbs in like he owns it. The taillights brighten and the car rolls out of frame. That was it. The officer said it looked like a random theft. Wrong place, wrong time. They'd put out a BOLO, but I felt sick. I had no ride, no house key, and no ID. He offered to drop me at home, but I told him I'd crash in the store office until morning. He took all the information and then he left. I laid there on the office couch, trying not to cry. Around 3:30 a.m., the same officer called back. They found my car, as it was abandoned in a parking lot 15 miles away. I asked if they caught the guy and he said no. He told me that he was going to send a unit to pick me up and bring me to the scene. A couple minutes later, another officer showed up. I got in the car and we headed out. When I got there, I swore my heart was about to jump out of my chest. The VW looked like it had been torn apart. The glove compartment was hanging open, papers scattered all over the seats and floor. My backpack had been unzipped and dumped out, with the chargers, receipts, a half-eaten granola bar, everything mixed in with footprints of dried mud. The air inside smelled faintly like sweat and gasoline. After looking around, I noticed the only thing that was missing was my purse. It was a small black one I kept my ID, debit card, and house keys in. They dusted for prints, took a few photos, and told me to ride back with them just in case. "We'll have a cruiser escort you home," one of them said. I didn't even argue. When we pulled up to my house, I noticed right away that the front door was cracked open, just an inch, but enough to make every hair on my neck stand up. I could hear my dog, Bailey, barking inside, loud and sharp. The officers motioned for me to stay back while they drew their flashlights and pushed the door open. "Richmond Police," one of them called out. They stepped inside and tried to calm down Bailey. They then swept the living room and kitchen. The officers then noticed that the doorway had muddy shoe prints smeared across the hardwood floor, leading from the entryway to the back hallway, then turning back towards the door. One of the officers crouched down and studied the tracks. "Looks like he came in, saw the dog, and bolted," he muttered. They cleared the rest of the house and no one else was inside. Bailey was still growling, tail low, staring at the door like she wanted to chase whoever it was. When the officers finished, they told me what they thought happened. The guy stole my car, drove to my house using the address from my ID, then broke in. He then panicked when he saw the dog and ran back through the door. He took off again in my car and dumped it. I stood there in the doorway, staring at the faint muddy prints drying on my floor, and it hit me how close I came to walking in on him. Maybe if I took that offer to get a ride home, we might have ran into him. The officer told me to bolt the door with the chain before he left. I nodded, but it didn't make me feel safer. That night I slept on the couch with Bailey beside me, with her head resting on my leg. Every creak, every rustle outside sounded like footsteps. The whole time one thought kept circling in my head. He'd been inside my car, he'd been inside my house, and somewhere out there, he still has my keys and ID.